What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to the vlog. This is the episode for Friday, September 24th, 2021. And I don't have notes for this episode, but there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. First of all, very briefly, I am not sure what the status of next week's lighting video is going to be. I have been working on it all week this week, essentially, and I don't have a tremendous amount of buffer for those lighting videos. They're a little bit more, it's a little bit harder content for me to produce than the EOS R5 videos, where I'm extremely familiar with the camera and the situation and whatnot, and I can really just shoot notes together and put a video out very quickly on that. It's not that I'm not familiar with the lighting. I'm just trying to be more thorough with my discussion and how I organize things and how I present it, because it's potentially more complicated. It's a different subject, and it's a different presentation and so forth. And so I have had a bit more of a struggle to get it to them, or get them done well. That said, either way, I'm going to probably have a video up next Wednesday when it should be the lighting video. It just might not be the lighting video. It may be another R5 tip video pushed out ahead of schedule. So that was the one thing. Lighting stuff going on. Again, if I had a better thought process on how to shoot it. I've said this before, that for me, a lot of all of this is a learning experience, and it's converting knowledge of how things should be done to actually understanding how to do it. And that's really the problem that I've run into with the next step in the lighting video, is how to actually do the photography, how to actually shoot the video. I am trying to work on doing more B-roll in my videos, so some more not just looking at me talking to the camera shots, and that's going to be, I think, a big thing going forward for me, is to focus on doing that a lot. So that's that. The next thing that I wanted to touch on briefly is, as I mentioned, I think last week, I am working on a video compression discussion. And it's certainly, some things that have come up with that are certainly frustrating to me. So one of those is DaVinci Resolve. Now, I'm specifically talking about the free version of DaVinci Resolve. Now, I use DaVinci Resolve. I use the free version. I'm fairly happy with it. It's a pretty good NLE. I haven't had any real problems with it. When I have run, the one problem I did run into with it, Blackmagic Design, took the bug report and addressed it in the next release, which was not that far into the future. And it was a very positive experience as an end user dealing with their support and so forth. The problem that I'm having here is, it's not a problem of capability, it's a problem of documentation. And this is one of those things that always frustrates the heck out of me when it comes to products. So yes, DaVinci Resolve is free, and there's a very real cadre of people who will say things such as, it's free, you shouldn't complain, it's great software that you're not paying for. And it's great software that I'm not paying for, that I'm using the free software and it's not an evaluation, it's free, it's available, and it has limitations. And I am completely 100% down with and understand that companies have to make money, and that they can't give everything away. And then when it comes to software, there has to be things that the full version or the paid version does that the free version maybe doesn't. I mean, I get that, and I'm not complaining about that, because quite honestly, that's fair as far as I'm concerned. Where I get frustrated and bothered by all of this is when things aren't documented. So, for example, in the free version of DaVinci Resolve, there are filters and effects. For example, noise reduction. That is a feature of the premium version, the DaVinci Resolve Studio, the paid version of the product. And if you go to add noise reduction to your video, it will, first of all, pop up a little dialog box that says that this is a feature of the paid version. Would you like to upgrade? And second of all, it puts a very obvious watermark over the video that the noise reduction is doing, because it'll actually show you and do the noise reduction and show you the results and let you do that. But it very clearly watermarks the video so that you're not able to use this in any kind of production environment. So you're not, this is a feature that was behind the paywall that requires you to upgrade to the studio version. Easy peasy. I'm fine with that. It's disclosed. I'm informed. There's notifications, whatnot. What bothers me is when the documentation says something and then it only means some of what it says. So in looking at the supported video formats and codecs for DaVinci Resolve, the free version, it says that the software supports AVC or H.264 and HEVC or H.265. Now, I ran into this because I've been working on a project for, as I said, video compression comparison. And one of the things that I've been looking at is going to 422 storage. Now, partly that's a product of the way I'm recording things right now, and will probably be recording things going forward for the foreseeable future. So my 5D Mark IVs, they don't do 422 internal recording, but they will do 422 over HDMI. So the signal that they're giving the camera, or they're putting into the computer, because I'm recording these through computer as opposed to through the camera, can be is 422. Now, under my current recording setup, I'm not getting 422 image quality. I'm getting 420 chroma subsampling, and I understand that, and I'm fine with it. My R5, however, if it's set to HDR-PQ or Canon log, records 422 and 10-bit, as opposed to 420 and 8-bit. Not that I'm using that at the moment. I should also be clear about that. The short of it is, or the long of, well, whatever, getting back to the point, HEVC and AVC have a variety of what are called profiles that enable higher or different bit rates and different abilities for chroma subsampling. So AVC has a high 422 profile that allows the AVC files to store 422 chroma subsampled video. HEVC has a number of 10-bit, 12-bit profiles, as well as 422 and 444, as well, and in both cases it does 420. Okay, where am I going with this? So in the process of playing around with transcoding and compression and handling things, I've been playing around with going to 422 as my archival format. Now, I understand that if I'm taking footage from my cameras, it's not going to be 422, and I'm not actually going to reprocess that, unless, of course, it's 422 from the R5. However, for like these videos, I can take the footage, store it as 422 chroma subsampled data, and again, as I upgrade and improve the recording setup, so get better recording equipment essentially, would be able to have higher quality information or higher quality video stored. So instead of storing 420, store 422. So this is what I ran into. In the documentation for DaVinci Resolve Free, they say it supports AVC and HEVC. It just says yes. However, it only supports the 420 profiles. It does not support 422 or 444. Now, again, going back to why I prefaced this whole little bit by talking about, I understand that software that's given or offered for free with a paid upgrade or a paid full version has to have limitations, or, you know, and I'm fine with that. There's no documentation of this. There's nothing in the documentation that says, you know, little asterisk 420 chroma subsampled 8-bit only. It's not there. When you bring a 422 or 10-bit file into Resolve, the free version, you get an audio track. And there's no pop-up, there's no warning, there's no notification, there's nothing in the software that says, hey, this looks like it's a 422 chroma subsampled file, or this looks like it's a 10-bit file. If you want to have support for this, upgrade to the full version of DaVinci Resolve. And that bothers me. Not so much that I'm not going to use DaVinci Resolve or that I'm getting rid of the software or something like that. It just frustrates and bothers me because it's documentation that, in my case, I ended up spending reshooting several videos that I had shot and had in 422 because that was how I had the server set up, my server set up to compress them. And I would bring the video into Resolve and it wouldn't work. And so I would go back and I would try recompressing it to something else or somehow. I would mess with the compression options. I would change things around and bring it back into Resolve, and it still wouldn't work. And the one thing I wasn't changing, obviously, was the chroma subsampling, because the intent was, well, I'll just go 422. But I tried changing codecs. Now, of course, if you bring it in as ProRes, which is 422, it works fine. Same thing with DNxHR in 422, it works fine. So where am I going with this? I don't know. I'm kind of just ranting on it because I find it to be an incredibly frustrating thing that, you know, here we have, you know, software that's like, and I find it incredibly frustrating for me personally because I spent about 2 days recompressing video, trying to figure out what was broken on my end because I could open the thing in certain or other video players and it would work fine. But when I tried to bring it into Resolve, it was just an audio track and there was no notification of what was wrong or why it wouldn't read the file. And eventually, digging through discussions online, finding somebody who was asking why the video that they shot in HDR or Canon log on their R5 couldn't play in DaVinci or wouldn't play in DaVinci Resolve free led to, well, it doesn't support 422 and 10-bit for AVC or HEVC because it's a limitation of the free version. And yeah, it's not documented anywhere. There's nothing there's nothing there that says that it will or won't work. So I don't know, frustrating. And I just, like I said, I kind of wish that it would be my preference that if you're going to have limitations, and I'm perfectly fine with there being limitations, they should be documented. Or at minimum, it would have been great if it just popped up something in the program and said, hey, this isn't compatible. You need to have the full version. And then I'd be like, oh, okay, I understand what the problem is. But not understanding what the problem is because it's arbitrary that it's not doing something or it doesn't support something, and then spending a whole bunch of time trying to figure out by trial and error why and what, and then finding out that, yeah, oh no, it doesn't support that. It's just not documented. The documentation hasn't caught up. Documentation is incredibly important in software for users using it. So that's the rant. One thing I found interesting about the whole thing is changing my thoughts on, now I've always been a fan of H.264 and H.264. I won't say a fan. I've always appreciated H.264 and H.265. And I've always felt that things like ProRes are, well, I understand the need for them in certain circumstances, but I'm increasingly not sure that there needs to be ProRes anymore, or that H.264 and 265 can't do the job. And a lot of that comes down to, and people say, oh, yeah, but ProRes isn't lossless. Actually, yes, ProRes is lossless. But a lot of that comes down to the function of ProRes. The reason we have ProRes is when you're talking about video compression, you have a trade-off between file size and computational complexity. So you can make something a lot less computationally complex, but the file size is going to be bigger. So it's easier to encode and decode, but you're going to have bigger files. Conversely, you can make things that are easier or you have smaller files, but it takes a lot more computational horsepower to encode or decode those files. ProRes exists largely to be a low computational product, it overhead, compression system. And I'm not saying it's bad, but the trade-off is file size. And I'm finding, generally speaking, in the tests that I've already done, that, for example, I can use doing all eye compression using AVC, which isn't even as efficient as HEVC, using AVC, exceed the quality of ProRes proxy at 1/2 to 2/3 the bitrate. I can match or exceed, in many cases, the quality of ProRes LT at, again, about 1/2 to 2/3 the bitrate. So for 1080p video, ProRes LT is about 80 megabit. And if I'm using H.264, and again, this is apples to apples, so it's all I, which is what ProRes is, and it's 422 chroma subsampled. Now I'm doing 8-bit in the HEVC case, although I have tested it at 10-bit, and I see essentially the same performance. Well, I shouldn't say that. It is 10-bit. I was testing this at 10-bit with HEVC. And I am getting, as I said, similar quality. Now, it's never going to be perfect. It perfectly identical in terms of, and I'm using PSNR and SSIM as metrics, predominantly PSNR, because PSNR is a mathematical, it's not a visual perceptual thing. It's a purely mathematical thing. So if the PSNR, the peak signal noise ratio, is infinity, their two things are identical mathematically. Visually, we have more room to play with, but that's where also we get into throwing away information or information loss generation to generation. But I can get essentially the same, plus or minus tiny little bits that are almost entirely meaningless, less than a decibel in some cases, performance out of AVC and HEVC as I'm getting out of ProRes for way fewer bits. Now, of course, the reason that this is happening is, and this is answering one of the questions that I had going into looking at this whole thing, is how do the two compare? HEVC and AVC have significantly better, or more, well, I won't say better. They have significantly more math going into figuring out how to make things smaller than ProRes does. And as a result, they have significantly or can have significantly smaller file sizes for the same image quality. And as I said, ProRes is a lossy codec. It does throw information away. There is image degradation from generationally. So that's been actually quite interesting. I'm not completely done with the testing. I'm not, I don't potentially want to go into it that far. But the one thing that's also kind of become enlightening about the whole thing, looking at ProRes versus AVC and HEVC, is the computational side of things. So the big advantage that I see with ProRes touted is that it's easier for your computer to decode. It's easier for your computer to process and render. And so you can have either more streams in a multicam setup going through ProRes, or you can have a smoother playback with less processor resources being devoted to it. Now, the problem is, as I see it, is in this day and age, every computer's GPU can decode AVC and HEVC. Well, every relatively modern computer's GPU can decode HEVC and AVC in hardware, where there is no performance penalty. It's being done. It's completely hardware accelerated. You can decode potentially more AVC and HEVC streams in hardware than you can have ProRes being decoded in software. Again, another limitation of DaVinci Resolve Free is unless you have an M1 Mac, DaVinci Resolve Free doesn't allow you to do GPU decoding of video because it's a feature of Studio. Now, the reason it exists on the M1 Mac is that Apple's M1 processors, basically, it needs to have the hardware acceleration to maintain the power efficiency and the performance that you would expect using the software. The reality is as good as M1 is, Apple's M1 processor is, it is not a 32-core Zen, Ryzen, or Threadripper, or a high-end Intel or multi-processor Xeon system, or any of that kind of things. It is a low power mobile CPU that in many cases relies on hardware acceleration. And all laptops are going to rely on, and to a large extent, on hardware acceleration for decoding video. But this is also the reason why I don't think that it's such a huge bad thing to look at using computationally more complex video codecs that can deliver better image quality at lower bit rates, or equal image quality at lower bit rates, because we have hardware now that will decode the video for us instead of having to rely on the CPU to do it itself. Again, there's the paid versus free situation, which isn't really that big of a deal. There's also the getting everybody on board and getting everybody to support playback hardware video, or hardware playback of video streams, which seems to be one of those things to a certain extent in NLEs. It's not the primary feature going. So the third thing I want to talk about in this episode is actually a lens idea. And I'm throwing this out there largely because I'm curious to see if I'm out in right field, left field, center field, the parking lot, or some 3 counties over playing a completely different sport. So, and in fact, this starts from a video that I was a discussion I was actually having with a photographer friend of mine locally, that, we were talking about gear, and I had mentioned that there were kind of 2 lenses that I really wish I could get from Canon as Canon OEM lenses. And the 2 lenses are the Nikon 120 to 300 f2.8 and the Sony 200 to 600 5.6 to 6.3. Because they both, to me, they're interesting as a product. Not interesting enough to switch platforms for. And yes, I know Sigma makes a 120 to 300 2.8 for Canon's EF mount, and I'm not that interested in a 120 to 300 2.8 to buy the Sigma. It's something that I would be more interested in potentially if it was an OEM Canon lens. Well, personally, I've had bad luck or bad experiences with third-party lenses, so I just don't really look at Sigma, Tamron, etc. all that strongly. Now, Sigma's cinema lenses, largely in my experience too, have dealt with quality control and autofocus performance. Now, on a mirrorless camera, autofocus performance should be much less of an issue because the sensor's focusing. You don't have the potential alignment issues, but then you still have possible issues with the drive and the control of the focus motors in the lens. The other issues that I've had have been quality, where either I've had to fight with lenses to get a good lens. I've watched photographers, and I can't believe that their time is worth so little to them that they would buy 5 or 6 lenses to get the one sharp copy and then return 4 or 5 of the 5 or 6 lenses. Like, to me, that's just madness. That, if you can't get a sharp copy in 1 or 2 lenses, at most, like, ideally the first lens you get should be sharp. Like, you should not have issues with it. So I tend to, when it comes to autofocus lenses for still photography, I tend to not really consider third parties. Now, if you're talking about manual focus cinema lenses, then I'm much more open to third parties, largely because there's very little interaction that I have to worry about with the camera. It's put the lens on front of the camera and go and you have to do everything, which I'm not a huge fan of, but anyway. So, as I was saying, the Sony 200 to 600 is interesting to me because 200 to 600 is sort of a useful range for me in wildlife photography, and I'd rather have I'm not wed to the idea of needing a 600 f4. I carried a 600 f4 when I was in Yellowstone a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, it wasn't the 3rd generation Canon one. It was a 2nd generation Canon one, which means it was still really heavy. And it's really heavy, and they're really big. And if I could get 600, that would be, in a zoom, that would be really good. Plus, I like the flexibility of a zoom. So I like being able to, as a bear or bison or leopard or whatever is walking towards me, I can adjust the focal length to keep the composition I want. It doesn't just go, oh, nice shot, to I'm taking a picture of its nose and that's all that fits in the frame. Or eye, and that's all that fits in the frame. The other lens, like I said, is the Nikon 120 to 300, and that kind of interests me for different reasons that I can't completely articulate because I don't completely understand them myself. It seems like it would be a very interesting lens to shoot for some wildlife stuff, but more for sports photography and that kind of thing. Which I don't really do any sports photography, so I have no idea to a certain extent why I would be that interested in that lens. Anyway, here's the idea. A 100 to 300 f2.8 with a built-in 2x teleconverter and the ability to mount a teleconverter to the rear. And here's my thought process. A 100 to 300 f2.8 is probably going to be in the same ballpark weight-wise, or can probably be done in the same ballpark weight-wise as a 200 to 400. But as a 100 to 300, you get that 100 millimeters on the wide end that I think is important and useful. So I like the 100 to 400 and the 100 to 500 that Canon has now, even though I still can't get a 100 to 500 because they're out of stock everywhere. But in the case of either of those lenses, I'm very comfortable with my next lens down being a 24 to 70. And the 70 to 100 gap, I just don't really care that much about. Yes, it's a gap, but it's not such a gap that it's insurmountable. So I can either shoot at 70 and crop a little to get 85 or 90, or I can shoot at 100 and take a step back and get the same kind of thing going on 85 or 90. I don't like the 200 to 400 or the Nikon 180 to 400 or the Sigma 200 to 600 because I run into that problem of you need cover. I need or feel that I need coverage below 200. I've run into way too many circumstances where photographing an animal from a car and it's a walk towards the car and 200 wouldn't cut it. I've actually had, and on the first trip that I had to Alaska, I had a humpback whale come up on a feeding lunge within 20 feet of the dock that we were sitting at to get onto a boat to go whale watching. And I had my teleconverter on my lens, so I was limited to 140, and that was even too wide. Like, I really needed to be down to 100. So there have been situations, as I said, where having the ability to go wider than 200 has been a thing. I also prefer to travel light. I've watched numerous people have numerous problems trying to do something where they're going somewhere and they're having to take 3 or 4 lenses, and either causes problems with carry-on weight restrictions or carry-on size restrictions, or just general hassle of they have all this weight or all this gear, and where I can just zoom back and I'm down to 100, they're putting down one camera and lens and picking up another and having to shoot with that, which of course means you need another camera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where the 200 to 600 kind of loses it for me. Now, the 200 to 600 being a 5.6 to 6.3 lens doesn't really bother me. Modern cameras, first of all, have autofocus systems that can absolutely handle f8, f11, f22. The EOS R5 can do servo movie focus at like f32, according to my testing. So it's not like you can't focus the lenses in the way that, in the past, DSLRs in the late 2000s, you were lucky to have one f8 sensitive autofocus point. In most cameras, you had no f8 sensitive autofocus point. So it became fairly important to have an f4 lens to get full use out of the autofocus sensor. Well, it's not really the case on an EOS R mirrorless, or any other mirrorless really for that matter. Plus, sensor technology has gotten to the point that I don't need to shoot at f4. I can shoot at 5.6 or 8 and still have good images, still have enough shutter speed, even in low lights, by going up to higher ISOs. Now, yes, purist, I always want to shoot at ISO 100, or I'd love to always be able to shoot at ISO 100, but as anything in photography, exposures are all a balancing act. It's shutter speed, it's noise, it's depth of field. And, quite honestly, when I was shooting with the 600, and a lot of times when I'm shooting with my 100 to 400, shooting wide open doesn't give me enough depth of field to do what I want to do or get the picture that I want. Like, I have pictures from Yellowstone of bison where I was shooting wide open, and the only thing that's in focus is its eye, and the entire rest of the head is out of focus because of how shallow, because of how shallow the depth of field is from a big lens at not tremendously huge subject distances. So you're talking, when a bison's head fills the frame versus when the whole bison doesn't even fill the frame, kind of subject distances. So 100 to 300 gives you a good range. It would be good for sports photographers, and it gives you a good working range as far as I'm concerned, even as a wildlife photographer at the bottom end. You have the ability to zoom out, essentially. And from a travel perspective, you've got one lens. It's, you're not having to carry another lens to cover that 70 to 100 millimeter gap, unless you absolutely wanted to. Now, teleconverter. Why not just make it a full zoom? Why not do a teleconverter? Well, the reality, as far as I can tell, is that you can build a 3x zoom that's a better quality lens than a 6x zoom. And you can build, and Canon has a ton of experience with this because almost every broadcast TV lens that they build has a built-in teleconverter. You can build an integral teleconverter that's designed to work optically with the lens that has minimal, if any, degradation and in terms of image quality. And we see this with the 200 to 400. The integral teleconverter basically provides the exact same image quality as the lens without the integral teleconverter enabled. So you go from 200 to 280, f4 to 5.6, and you still have the same thing, same image quality. Now it's a 1.4, but again, traditionally the issue with external teleconverters is that they can't be matched to the lens. So it's a generic teleconverter that's magnifying the lens, not a specific teleconverter that can compensate for the things that it's magnifying for the lens. So if you know, for example, that your base lens with a 2x teleconverter, activated would have an issue with, say, chromatic aberrations, the teleconverter for that's specific for that lens, that integral teleconverter, can be designed to counter those chromatic aberrations, or at least some of the image quality issues. Now, of course, the lens still has to be really good to start with. And, we're not talking a $700,000 lens here anyway. So that's kind of, I think, a given, is that it would be a really good lens. Now, I like 2x in this case instead of 1.4x, and I like it because I think it adds a lot of value to the thought process of the lens. So you flip the teleconverter on and you go from a 100 to 300 2.8 to a 200 to 600 5.6. Well, 5.6 is still a perfectly adequate aperture for shooting a lot of things. Certainly in the case of Sony's 200 to 600, 5.6 is more than adequate. Nikon has a very nice 200 to 500 5.6 that, again, 5.6 is very adequate. You're sure you might run into situations where, obviously in super low light, trying to get the optimum image quality, you might want a 4 or 2.8. But then, for example, like, talk about sports photography. A lot of sports photographers have moved to 200 to 400 f4s because the flexibility is so much better than a 400 2.8 and something else. On top of that, as again, image quality in cameras has improved to the point that you can shoot at a higher ISO than you could, say, with film. That 2.8 isn't so absolutely critical. And then again, for shutter speed reasons, and then again, when you're talking about shooting with a big telephoto lens, yes, a faster aperture, like all lenses, will blur the background more. So you will get better background bokeh. However, depth of field and background blur inherently is shallower, depth of field shallower, background blur is inherently greater when using telephoto lenses than when using wider angle lenses. So needing a really fast aperture to get good bokeh on, say, a 50 millimeter lens is a completely different situation from needing how fast of an aperture you need to get good background bokeh on a 400 millimeter lens, especially keeping the compositions the same. So if it's a full height portrait, 50 versus 400, the subject's going to be so much further away at 400. The background is likely going to be even further away in talking about general things, and the angle of view is going to isolate the background down so much more that you're going to have, just in general, it's not as big of a loss. It's still a loss, and there's still going to be people who aren't going to want it, but it's not as big of a loss. And that gets you out to 600 5.6 in a lens that's still a 200 or 100 to 300 2.8 sized package. Now, the reason I say still make it so that you can put a teleconverter on the back is then you can put a 1.4 on the back externally. Now, even cooler would be is if you had two teleconverters inside, so you could pick 1.4 or 2. You wouldn't be able to stack them, but you could pick 1.4 or 2x, and then they would both be optimized, and then that would be really good. But you could put a 1.4 on, and the 100 to 300 becomes a 140 to 420 f4, which now puts you in the league of replacing the 100 to 400s. So a 100 to 400, or not a 100 to 400, 200 to 400. 200 to 400 f4, you're talking a 140 to 420 f4, which again hits that spot for the sports photographers. It hits the spot. It's a decent lens for wildlife use. So I'm seeing a lens like this, which to me seems entirely within reason. Well, we've got at least 2 companies who've done 120 to 300s. I don't see any reason that 120 can't be dropped to 100 to give you a 100 to 300. We know that good quality, optimized teleconverters can be built into lenses because, well, Nikon's done that with their 180 to 400. They followed after Canon, actually, who did it with the 200 to 400, and Canon only leveraged what they're doing with broadcast lenses in their broadcast TV lens area, where almost everything has a 1.5 or a 2x teleconverter built into it from the get-go. So it seems like all of this seems feasible. So the question I'm posing is and I'm not trying to ignore budget, because if you're looking at a 200 to 400, like if you're looking at a Canon 200 to 400 right now, they're 12 or 13 grand, I think, still. So we're talking about that class of cost, but we're talking about potentially a lens that would be more flexible than a 200 to 400 4 with a teleconverter. For probably around the same weight, might be a touch heavier, but would that touch heavier really make that much of a difference? Because, if with all the flexibility that I'm getting, it's a 100 to 300 at 2.8, a 140 to 420 at f4, a 200 to 600 at 5.6, and again, assuming you could put teleconverters on the back, and this wasn't all integral, or even if it was all integral, you could put a 1.4 or a 2 on the back to stack out to the 2 internal plus a 2 on the back would give you a 400 to 1200 f16, I think it's something like that, which, okay, yeah, that's a small aperture. That's probably not, going to be, tremendously great. But then on the same token, where do you, how often do you really, would you really be doing that? And again, an R5 could easily focus with that. That's not an impediment for the R5 to shoot. Or would it be an F11? I think it would be an F11, actually. So that's not even half as bad. Anyway, so I'm throwing this out there as an idea. Now, obviously, I'm never going to get Canon to do this. I can hope. They're it's a dream. So since this is a dream, I'm throwing down to the comments for anybody who watched this far and who's thought about any of this stuff enough. What does this sound like to you? I mean, does this sound totally insane to you? I mean, maybe it's not your cup of tea because you're not a wildlife photographer or sports photographer, in which case I get it. It's the great thing about an interchangeable lens camera, right? Is you don't have to buy the same lens as I do. But if this sounds like something like that sounds interesting or sane to you, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Because I'm interested, like I said, I'm trying to figure out if my thought process here is in the ballpark or if I'm in some other county playing a completely different sport, and that this is totally, nobody would actually want this. So I've run for about 45 minutes now, and I'm going to wrap this up here. So if you thought this was interesting or informative, please consider smashing that like button. Wait, before I say that, EOS R video series, tips and tricks series, is still running on Mondays. Next week, maybe Monday and Wednesday, depending on whether I get the lighting video done. I am still working on the lighting series that I've been doing. It's not been that popular, which I completely understand because it's not telling you how to do something super simply. But I'm running into some glitches and hiccups with just how to shoot and produce the videos. That's something that I'm working through. Hopefully we'll be getting that back rolling with more how-to-ish type of videos, or at least more concrete videos. So those are going up on Wednesday, although next week it may not be the case. So with that in mind, if any of that sounds interesting to you, or you're just into photography, please consider subscribing. Like I said just before, if this was interesting to you, informative, etc., please consider smashing that like button. Drop a comment below if you have some thoughts on any of the stuff I've talked about. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.